Well, good morning and welcome to Do You Know Where Your Company's Personal Information Is? Chris, that sounds pretty ominous. It kind of reminds me of when I was a kid and many towns had curfews. At 11 p.m. the announcer would come on TV and the message would come across the screen. It's 11 p.m. Do you know where your kids are? It's actually a fitting analogy for today's session. Years ago, municipalities operated under the basic assumption that if parents knew where children, in particular teenagers, or at night, they stood a much better chance of keeping them out of harm's way and less chance of them violating the laws. Common sense. For today's purposes, we are proposing the same basic assumption, that if companies only understood where personal data about their employees and customers exist across the organization, they stand a much better chance of keeping personal information out of harm's way and in compliance with privacy laws. Joining me today is Chris Zolads, founder of Navigate, LLC. Prior to founding Navigate, Chris was Vice President, Information Protection and Privacy at Marriott International. In this role, Chris had responsibility for all global information protection and privacy activities, including executive advocacy, policy, awareness programs, training, information mapping, risk assessment, and remediation. Prior to Marriott, Chris was the Mid-Atlantic Director of IT Auditing and Security Services for Ernst & Young. And Chris is the past chairman and founding board member of the International Association of Privacy Professionals and recipient of the 2006 IAPP Vanguard Award as the Chief Privacy Officer of the Year. So thank you, Chris, for bringing a wealth of practical experience to today's session. And I am Marty Provin with Jordan Lawrence. I'm a certified information privacy professional and have spent the last 10 years working with in-house legal counsel and privacy officers, helping them address privacy and other information governance concerns. Now, we've left time at the end of today's session for question and answers. So please submit your questions by emailing them to mprovin@jordanlawrence.com, and we will answer as many as we can at the conclusion. Now, in our collective experiences, there's one basic truth that bears out. If a company doesn't know where sensitive information is, there is no way they can adequately protect it, manage it, or confidently comply with privacy laws and industry standards. So in the next 30 minutes, we're going to provide you with some great insights and examples of how you can make a significant impact on your company's position on privacy, actions you can take to reduce the risk of data breach and help ensure compliance with the tangled web of state, federal, and for many of you on today's call, international privacy laws. We'll demonstrate a proven process for developing an inventory of personal data and discuss steps you can take to reduce risk and ensure compliance. So Chris, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thanks, Marty. So let's start with some basic objectives that a company would have in mind when they think about managing the personal data entrusted to them and what is needed to ultimately reach these objectives. The first objective is obviously to keep personal data safe and avoid a breach. Second, to comply with privacy laws, to align security controls with business processes, and to align employee behavior with good privacy practices. Now let's take a closer look at the objectives and where companies miss the mark. The first objective is to keep personal data safe and avoid a breach. Now, it is generally accepted in the privacy and security communities that the majority of data breaches are due to or a result of bad business processes and not security flaws per se. There is ample research that supports this fact, including a Ponemon Institute's annual study on the cost of data breaches. The study has consistently shown that over 88% of data breaches involve negligence, policy noncompliance, and unauthorized practices. For example, 36% of breaches involve lost or stolen computers and other portable storage devices. Privacy regulations generally define very specific attributes that determine if the information falls under the requirement or not. For example, the EU defines sensitive data as having attributes like sexual orientation, philosophical beliefs, and political affiliation. In the U.S., state requirements like Mass 201 define covered data as having attributes including Social Security number, driver's license number, financial account number, or credit or debit card number. In the case of Mass 201, the business must understand the processes that involve covered information. Is it always encrypted? When in paper form, is it shredded? When it leaves the brick and mortar facilities on portable media, is it encrypted? Additionally, as a practical consideration in cross-border litigation involving personally identifiable data. Courts in Europe have considered regular access to personally identifiable data, even if the data remains in country, as being the same as exporting the data. In order for a company to truly evaluate the level of risk and ensure appropriate safeguards are in place, they must understand the processes their business people are involved with, the nature of the information they are working with, and specifically, the discrete elements of the information that constitute personally identifiable or sensitive information. Many companies only get as far as assigning data classifications to applications the business people have access to, but do not identify the downstream processes that actually create the risk or exposure. In the example of avoiding a data breach due to a lost laptop or portable storage device, the privacy and security team needs to understand when business people are engaging in processes that create the exposure. IT understands the assets that people have, but rarely understand the nature of the information the business people work with. To truly evaluate and mitigate legal risk, you have to understand what business people are doing with sensitive information at a very discrete level. Education on any governance issue ultimately leads to aligning behavior with policy and appropriate practices. In order to change employee behavior, you have to provide the employees with specific examples of the behavior that needs to be changed and provide a suitable workaround or new processes that meet the business objectives and the security and privacy objectives of the organization. You must have an intimate view into the business processes to enable training and education that brings about real and permanent change. We have all read articles about costly data losses, and unfortunately, we tend to think about data breaches being the result of a hacker activity, when in reality, most are a result of a bad business process and were likely avoidable had the organization been aware of the personal data, where the personal data was, and how it was being used. Here are 4 examples in the last few weeks alone that illustrate this point. 2 weeks ago, 9,000 students' personal information was compromised after it was taken out of one application and put into an Excel spreadsheet. This sort of common process can be difficult for security software to detect. In January, 2,000 individuals' data was compromised when paper documents were thrown out in the trash. In December, the all-too-common event of a stolen laptop that had personal data cost the company $300,000 to date in legal fees. And the most significant incident from these examples involved Sutter Health. In the case of Sutter Health, the company issued password-protected, unencrypted desktop computer was stolen from their administrative offices. Approximately 4 million patients had their names, addresses, dates of birth, phone numbers, email addresses, medical record numbers, and health insurance plan name exposed. Can you imagine 4 million records on an unencrypted laptop? It may seem hard to believe, but it happens all the time. 2 lawsuits have been filed against Sutter Health. One class action suit alleges that Sutter Health was negligent in safeguarding its computers and data, and that did not notify millions of patients whose data went missing within the time required by state law. The suit seeks $1,000 for each member of the class and attorney's fees, all because a single laptop had 4 million individuals' information on it, not encrypted. It's amazing, but all too common. Many breaches, perhaps most breaches, can be avoided by developing a detailed personal data inventory and understanding where and how personal data is managed and consequently exposed. The PDI is one of the greatest, if not the greatest, challenge that many privacy leaders face. Quite simply, you can't possibly protect personal information if you don't know where your organization's personal information is, which includes both within your organization and at your service providers and at any of their service providers. In order to meet privacy objectives and comply with laws, companies must know their information. So the key elements of a personal data inventory include what records and information you have, where they exist and are stored, what specific elements of PII they contain, how long they are retained, and the associated business processes that move the information throughout and outside of the organization. So let's take a look at a real-life example of a PDI. In this example, we are looking at personnel files. Personal data inventory mapped these records to finance, human resources, and operations. Here we see the media types each area maintains this information in, which may represent redundancies that contribute to the challenge of securing information. Here are the different versions that were identified. And this is important, each area's business need or reference value. Here we see how long each area is retaining personnel files, and for each media type. Retention is an important consideration for two reasons. First, many privacy laws impose retention limitations on personal information. Mexico's privacy law, for example, provides for up to $1.5 million fine for retaining personal data too long. And secondly, keeping personal data longer than it needs creates unnecessary risk. In the infamous Sony breach last year, one of the databases exposed was legacy information, and it should not have even been around. And each area identified the various storage locations where they commonly keep personnel files. Here we see the various types of sensitive information tied to personnel files. As new privacy laws are enacted and existing privacy laws change, companies need to know this level of detail in order to comply with the laws. Equally important, this detail is necessary to understand where true risk exists. So where do you start? To develop a personal data inventory, you have to look inside the business practices and talk to the business people. After all, they are really the only ones that know what records and information they have in use, the specific data elements they contain, how long they retain it, and what they are doing with the information. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Marty for a description of how to approach creating a data inventory in an efficient manner.
Thanks, Chris. Well, hopefully, Chris has made a believer out of you, if you weren't already, of the importance of having an inventory or a map, or whatever you want to refer to it as, of where your personal information truly exists in your organization. Now, I want to take a look at sort of the traditional ways companies approach this. The reality is, most organizations have no idea where personal data exists beyond, say, human resources, and certainly they have no semblance of an inventory. Most companies do have a privacy policy and a privacy statement on their website, but that's unfortunately about it. Those are all things that you have to have, but they really don't strike at the heart of the matter. Think about the breach examples Chris shared. Undoubtedly, those organizations all had done the basics. They still encountered a breach. You see, you really haven't moved off of square one until you've identified where the personal data lives. Nothing will illustrate this point more for you than if you take 30 minutes. I would encourage you to go to privacyrights.org. It's a site, if you're not familiar, that is a registry of all data breaches. And just look at the last 20 breaches that have occurred, and it'll be evident that inaction is no longer an option for organizations. So the next approach is this sort of what we call the do-it-yourself approach. And when companies go this route, success depends on knowing, what questions do I need to ask my business people, my IT folks, and who do I need to ask? A very common mistake that companies make is only looking as far as the business people and asking them to assign data classifications. Like, is this information confidential? Now, data classifications serve a purpose, but they are truly subjective labels as opposed to identifying concrete elements that information contains. So, for example, does the information a business area work with contain social security numbers or first and last names? Data classifications provide essentially no real utility in being able to evaluate compliance with privacy laws. Laws provide very specific concrete definitions of covered information, for example, first and last name in combination with social security numbers. So unless you've identified the very specific discrete elements, you really don't have anything useful or very useful in determining compliance with regulatory obligations. And apart from the challenges of structuring the information collection, There are the technical challenges of collecting and compiling this much information using spreadsheets. In the end, you're crushed by the burden of managing and reconciling hundreds of spreadsheets that yield inconsistent data. Time and time again, we hear professionals trapped in Excel hell. So lastly, the third option for companies is they hire a team of consultants that take over conference rooms and gobble up employees' time. Now, this approach is extremely expensive, it's time-consuming, and I think when you look back at the history of breaches, it really is questionable about how much value has been added for the investment that's made. So today, let's look at our process. It's proven, it's practical, it's cost-effective for any organization of any size, and this process works. So whether or not you work with Jordan Lawrence or you take the process and do it on your own, it's effective. So to get started, we start by identifying the business areas that need to be included in the personal data inventory. A word of caution, many companies only focus on the obvious areas like human resources. This limited approach is very problematic because primary areas that deal with personal data tend to be in good shape. Business folks in these roles are aware of the sensitive nature of the information they work with and tend to have reasonably good protocols. The reality is that personal data permeates the entire organization. And when you get to areas like marketing or sales or even safety, they tend to have very lax processes and don't have the same attention or awareness of sensitive or personal information they work with. So the business representatives that you do speak with anywhere in the organization, they're in touch with the nature of the information they deal with, how sensitive it is, how it's accessed, how it's shared, how it's stored, and how it's moved. Now, we conduct all of our profiling sessions or interview sessions online. It's very flexible for people to participate, much more accurate and consistent than face-to-face interviews, and a lot faster and a lot more cost-effective. So we start the business representatives by selecting record types in their area from a list that they're likely to use. Now, our approach is unique, but we have found that starting with record types is how business people tend to think about the information they have. So orienting business people using common references has proven to be much more effective than asking questions about data classifications. Once business representatives identify the record types, they would then associate them to key specific elements, including things like, does it include name, social security numbers, addresses, and email? Or in the case of EU data, we look for things like, does this information contain party affiliations or religious preferences? Other considerations a business might have would be, do my business people work with specific forms of government IDs or physical attributes? The bottom line is you have to get these attributes in order to evaluate your compliance with various privacy laws. There's simply no other way. And finally, the business people are asked to identify the related business processes. Like, is this information found in email or in paper? Where is the information stored? And what are the supporting applications? How is this information shared and who with? What third parties have access to this information? And a host of other critical attributes. This sort of information is critical in identifying where your organization is exposed to the potential for breach. And when you see the perspective you get from this process, I think the value is very evident. Here's an example of an inventory from a large retailer that illustrates several points we've discussed this morning. First, notice that in addition to human resources, customer service also maintains copies of employment information. The personal data inventory identifies the discrete elements that independently or in combination make records or applications personally identifiable. It's these combinations of personal data elements that are key in evaluating, again, compliance. And the data inventory tells you what the business processes are that potentially expose the data. The customer service area at this organization was maintaining tape copies, and more significantly, they had various business processes that included saving personal data to flash drives or to laptops. And even in the human resources area, they have a process in which they are taking data out of the HR system and putting it into PDFs. We also found this process in payroll services, in which they were exporting sensitive information out of the applicant tracking system, putting it into a report, PDFing it, and then emailing it to a third party. It's very common for business people who have appropriate credentials to access sensitive information to share bits and pieces of it with third parties. And when they share it in file structures like PDFs, it's virtually impossible for any security protocols to pick up on that. It can only be discovered by profiling the business people themselves to understand what these underlying business processes are. So our process enables you to identify these situations across your organization in as little as 45 days, with no business person spending more than 60 minutes. And since the profiling sessions are completed simultaneously, your entire organization can be covered from headquarters to every global operation in just a matter of weeks. I'm now going to turn it back over to Chris for some thoughts on action items you can take once you've built your personal data inventory.
Well, thanks, Marty. So now that we have a personal data inventory created, there are 7 action items that we recommend. And the first is to review your policies and procedures. Do your policies support the desired and required information collection, security, and retention practices in the organization? Are the policies actionable? For example, if a policy states that only PII required to support business and legal needs should be collected and retained for the necessary time period, will employees really know what that means and what they should do on a day-to-day basis? In my experience, probably not. And for that reason, actionable policies and procedures need to be in place and communicated effectively to all affected employees and service providers. Next is education. Publishing and communicating policies and procedures to affected employees is simply not enough. They need to be trained on the core principles and practices to help ensure they understand what is required of them. The majority of employees will perform their job duties in accordance with the policies and procedures if they know what they are and are instructed about how to do so. Next is to minimize. Once the locations of all major personal information repositories in the company have been identified, the most impactful action to take is also the most obvious, challenging the business and legal need for all that information. A core business practice, including your policies and procedures, should be to collect the minimum amount of personal information required to execute the business transaction, manage the workforce, and meet any applicable legal requirements. Next is to eliminate. Duplicate storage of personal information can be avoided. Personal information inventory helps uncover numerous instances of the same personal information found on computer systems, files on desktops or laptops, network servers, backup tapes, portable media such as flash drives, CDs, or backup tapes, and also in paper records. Each of these instances of personal information must be protected and represents an information repository that can be lost or stolen. The cost to protect duplicate personal information can be substantial, not to mention the storage costs. Every reasonable effort should be made to eliminate duplicate information. Next is rank. Not all personal information is equal. An information repository that has many personal information data elements is more important than a repository with only a couple. In addition, information repositories with legally protected data elements such as name in combination with credit card data, or Social Security numbers, or driver's license numbers, or protected health information are also more important than others. When reviewing the information inventory collected during the assessment, assign a ranking to each information repository, with repositories that have legally protected or valuable commercial information as having the highest ranking, and those repositories with the fewest personal information data elements being the lowest ranked. This approach will help you focus on the highest ranking repositories first, before addressing the moderate and low ranking ones. Starting with the highest ranking information repositories, it is important to assess the adequacy of security measures in place. The next call to action is remediate. Once the risks have been identified and ranked, the next step is to remediate. Starting with the highest ranking information repositories that also have the highest risk ranking, develop a strategy to remediate any information security gaps that were identified. Focus on solutions that provide enterprise-wide benefit, but also consider the ongoing cost to sustain and maintain the solution. In addition, searching for compensating controls that may already be in place or could be enhanced to address the noted gaps is recommended. The last call to action is audit. To ensure the remedial actions were implemented as intended and are effective, a validation should be performed. The validation could take the form of a formal review by internal audit, or through a less formal approach, such as a walkthrough and talkthrough between information security, privacy, and other relevant stakeholders. And these are all action items that Navigate can assist with. Now with that, I'll turn it back over to Marty for our wrap-up and to take any questions that we may be able to take.
Hey, thanks, Chris. We've got several questions coming in, and unfortunately we're about out of time, but here's the most common one. No surprise, probably to you, Chris, but how do companies secure funding for these sorts of privacy initiatives?
Well, funding is always the challenge, and I think, as we had talked about earlier, I think one of the greatest challenges that privacy leaders face is just trying to understand where all this personal information is. I mean, to me, that is step one, or perhaps 1A or 1B, but it's a very high priority. And, I think every organization is obviously different in terms of what resonates and what will ultimately help folks loosen up the wallet. But I think the beauty of what we've laid out here, to your earlier points, Marty, is you all have Jordan Lawrence provides the process, the framework to do this work very, very efficiently. So you're not having to go in and ask your boss for $500,000 of funding to do this data inventory, which is certainly not something that's going to fly. But I think as it relates to funding, to be as thoughtful as you possibly can in terms of efficient approaches to accomplish what you need to accomplish, and then just sell it on its merits.
Yeah, and I tell you, the other thing that we've found is that, for years, organizations have wanted to get rid of information, and they can never sort of bring the executive team to that point. And with, this explosion of privacy laws that now address retention restrictions. So in the past, retention in the U.S. is, essentially thought about, hey, we got to keep it this minimum time period. Now, when companies are dealing with, I can't keep it any longer than a certain time period, I think that privacy becomes the catalyst which enables companies to actually purge information, which in return usually has a very healthy return associated with it. So one more question, Chris, that we've gotten is, who do you find typically responsible for privacy when there is not a chief privacy officer designated in the organization? Where does it fall?
Well, that's a great question. It's typically the person who wasn't at that meeting that day. No, just kidding. Generally, if there's not a privacy leader, I tend to see it fall in one of two places. It either tends to fall in the Office of General Counsel because of, no surprise, many of the legal underpinnings to the topic, or it will sometimes fall in the Office of the CIO.
Well, I think with that, we're actually a little past our time. We want to thank everybody for listening in today. This recording of this webcast will be available on our website within 48 hours, and we have a wealth of resources that are available at either jordanlawrence.com or at navigatellc.net. So with that, thank you all, and we wish you all a very good day.